Stress tests in any country's financial system or in a particular institution in that financial system is designed to assess A, the impact of adverse macroeconomic as well as institution-specific scenarios on the capital adequacy and solvency of that institution or the financial system as a whole, and B, the extent of capital cushion available to withstand such an adverse macroeconomic impact. More specifically, stress tests focus on the impact of credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, etc. in adverse situations, both at the level of the institution and at the systemic level. Stress tests actually involve laying down a set of adverse scenarios against which the financial institutions and or the country's financial system's resilience is measured. For instance, these could be a set of adverse scenarios considered in a stress test. Crude oil prices goes up by 100%, interest rates go up by X%, equity markets crash by more than Y%, unemployment rate doubles in a specific year, GDP falls by A% in a given year, long-term bonds issued by financial institutions and the underlying derivative contracts such as interest rate swaps are terminated suddenly way before maturity, say 5 years before maturity. Most central banks around the world, particularly those in the developed countries such as the United States, have mandated financial institutions with assets in excess of $50 billion to undertake stress tests periodically specific to each institution. This is in addition to the stress tests undertaken by the country's banking regulator from time to time. In the early part of this decade, US regulators mandated American banks to undertake stress tests twice a year, once internally by the bank and once by the banking regulator. Banks with assets from $10 billion to $50 billion were also required to undertake the Dodd-Frank Act stress test, DFAST for short. A good practice followed by many central banks requires that the results of such stress tests carried out by the banks under its jurisdiction are made available in the public domain to demonstrate the resilience of those banks to withstand major economic downturns. More recently, banking regulators have also mandated that financial institutions that do not come out favorably in the stress test should refrain from paying dividends to their shareholders, instead ensure a very high plowback so that the net worth of that institution can be shored up and brought up to a better position. Financial institutions that fail the stress test are also required to rework their business plan, restructure their asset portfolios, etc., do the stress test in a simulated environment and resubmit the results of those stress tests to the banking regulator for scrutiny. Stress testing acquired significant focus thanks to the 2008 financial crisis and the consequent new laws that came into being, such as the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 in the United States. Banking regulators in most countries have also implemented standardized documentation, such as the Comprehensive Capital Analysis and Review, CCAR for short, which is implemented in the United States to report stress test scenarios and the results thereof. All banking regulators around the world have resorted to a similar standardized procedure and documentation of stress tests to be carried out by the banks in the respective countries. Here's an example of what stress tests have revealed. The Supervisory Capital Asset Program, SCAP for short, of the United States, dated around early 2009, assessed all banking institutions with assets greater than 100 billion US dollars. That is, institutions that are considered, shall we say, too big to fail. This was done to establish the adequacy of Tier 1 capital in those institutions under stressed macroeconomic conditions. The results of the test showed that almost 50% of such banks were declared to have inadequate capital, although all of those banks met the mandated capital adequacy norms as per the Basel guidelines. 5 years later, in 2014, 25 banks failed the stress test conducted similarly by the European Banking Authority. Stress tests that are carried out by banking regulators in several countries to determine the ability of the country's financial system to withstand macroeconomic shocks are also termed as macroprudential analysis. Such macroprudential analysis would include examining the health of the individual financial institutions, including the quality of its assets, liquidity, capital adequacy, etc. And B, the ability of the financial system in that country as a whole to be able to cope with declining exchange rates for its currency, spike in interest rates, reduction in the profitability of individual financial institutions, etc. Institutions such as the Prudential Regulation Authority, or PRA, of the United Kingdom, or the European Banking Authority, EBA, of continental Europe, undertake such macroprudential analysis on an ongoing basis. Now let's turn our attention to stress testing in the payment and settlement system in any country. Remember, a settlement crisis arises when a financial institution participating in that country's payment and settlement system has a liquidity position that suddenly turns out to be a lot less than the total value of the payments that are required to be settled by that financial institution on any given day. Such an eventuality could actually set up a contagion resulting in several financial institutions in that system failing in rapid succession. You will recall that the 2008 financial crisis was significantly aggravated by the failure of some of the largest participants in the payment and settlement systems in the United States in particular, such as Lehman Brothers, when they failed to meet their settlement obligations. That in turn had a contagion effect, resulting in the failure of several institutions and a consequent unprecedented downward slide in the global financial system. As a result of that experience, financial stress testing of virtually all large value payment and settlement systems have also been implemented. Needless to add, a financial stress test is as much an art as it is a science, because such tests are normally dependent on the scenario envisaged for the stress test. As a case in point, stress tests carried out in 2009 by the European Banking Authority assumed a negative economic growth rate of minus 0.6% over a 5-year period, whereas that was actually reached within 2 years. And therefore, the adverse scenario had to be readjusted to a negative growth rate in the economies of minus 3 to minus 4%, and the stress test had to be repeated. And needless to add, that put out numbers which were even more surprising both for the regulators and for the financial system as a whole. To help you understand the structure and significance of stress tests, we have included after this video stress test report by the Federal Reserve for the year 2016, the JP Morgan stress test results also for 2016, and the Reserve Bank of India guidelines for stress testing issued in December 2013. A review of those web links would give you a great understanding of the purpose, the complexity, the outcomes, and the interpretation of those stress tests.